Okay, hi everybody. So here we are. We're going to talk today about lifestyle interventions to treat insulin resistance. So if you are watching this video, that means you are either in class with Brett right now, which is great. And if so, we're going to do, we have a bunch of opportunities where we're going to stop the video and we'll discuss like we normally would in class, and we can brainstorm and chalk talk and all those kind of things. And if you're not in class because you're watching this on your own, that's fine too. But I'm going to encourage you, make sure you stop, take the time, think about the material we're talking about, so that you get everything you can out of this, because there are a few moments to stop. I am going to be honest with you. This is, I think, the third or fourth time I've recorded this lecture. We've had some issues, which are kind of funny, but I can share them later. I'm currently recording this lecture from, it's basically a church chapel in New Zealand. Been a long few days of travel, but I want to make sure I get this up there so everybody can see it. So let's talk about lifestyle interventions. First thing I want to start with is actually a critical thinking assignment. And this is, as you know, a big part of this course is our ability to take information and think about it critically, which means make our own decisions about whether or not we trust that data, or do we interpret it maybe in the same way that it's written based on the data, or in the same way it's written, in this case, based on a science writer's opinion. So what I'm giving you here, I'm gonna give you the New York Times' version of what they interpreted from this study that came out. And the title here was, "The longer you work, the greater your risk for heart disease." So what are the facts as they presented them? This is published in the Journal of Occupational and Environmental Medicine fairly recently. And this is basically what they came up with. The more hours you work, the greater your risk for heart disease. Correctly, they state that several observational studies have found an association of the longer you work, the greater your increase for cardiovascular illness. But as this was published, there was a new analysis. It was retrospective, meaning it was looking backwards. And they found a dose-response relationship. Thus, the more of this you do, the more you're going to respond and show a greater chance of illness. So here's what they showed. Researchers began following almost 2,000 men and women back in the mid-'80s, and they tracked their health and how they worked all the way through 2011. Of those people, a little over 800 were given some diagnosis of cardiovascular disease. Okay, so that could have been anything from having heart pain to coronary artery disease, stroke, heart attack, hypertension, whatever it might be. Then what they did is they mathematically adjusted for things that they know are actually related to cardiovascular disease. So whether you're male or female, how much money you make, what neighborhood you live in, other factors like that. And what they found after adjusting for all those other things is that for each additional hour that somebody worked, there was a 1% increase in their risk for heart disease. So looking at the bottom paragraph there, if you compared somebody who worked 45 hours a week, so a fairly normal work week, versus somebody who worked an extra 10 hours, 55 hours a week, it increased the risk 16%. If you bump that up to 60 hours a week, it went up by 35%. 65 hours a week, it went up by 52%. 70 hours a week, 74%. So it keeps going up. You can see this dose response. So let's take a minute. Let's think about that. What do we think critically about this? Do we buy it? Does it seem realistic? Could there be alternative hypotheses? So I'm going to get Brett to stop it. Let's take about 5 minutes now. Talk to your neighbors. What do you think? Okay, good. So hopefully there was some good discussion there. If you're just playing the video through, hopefully you stopped and thought about this a little bit yourself. So on the surface level, what do we think? Does it make sense that working more could be related to heart disease? Well, yeah, I think there's pretty widespread knowledge, and it's reasonable to think that if work is a stressful environment, the more stress you expose your body to, the worse you're going to behave. I mean, we know that things like cortisol and other stress hormones wreak havoc on the body, and over time, that does seem like a reasonable supposition to me. Are there alternative hypotheses that we came up with? So I think that there probably are things that maybe can't be controlled mathematically. When we look at this, I mean, in essence, it is a observational, correlational type of finding, meaning they didn't take people and intentionally expose them to different amounts of stress and see who died earlier. You can imagine why they don't do that, because one, it would be a really tough study to run, and two, it would not be ethical to say we're going to see who we can kill or at least make sick by randomizing them to different groups, but let's think about maybe what that might mean then. Is it possible that these people selected into certain groups for certain reasons? So I'll give you one thing that jumps to mind is maybe if you're the kind of person that works 60 to 70 hours a week, it's not the fact that the work is the stress, but maybe you're just a stressed out person to begin with. Maybe you're totally type A, and the fact that you are willing to put yourself into that kind of work says a whole lot of stuff about you. So maybe it's the third variable. We talked last class about correlation and causation. So maybe it's not the work itself, but maybe the work is just a manifestation of who you are. So there's one thing. I think we could come up with a whole bunch of other alternative hypotheses, but I think this is a great example of how we need to be thinking about the information given to us and critically thinking, well, does that make sense? And is that the only explanation? Are there other explanations out there? So not to say that this wasn't a good paper, but that's the kind of exercise we want to be doing as we go through this. Okay, so what I actually had in here originally, the first few times that I recorded this lecture was, there's a slide on here and it had a bunch of short videos, and it's a documentary and online activity, and it's called Weight of the Nation. And it's done by HBO, so very high quality videos, some really cool tools that you can go check out. But the reason I've had to take it out is because after recording this one time, I found out that HBO, that content, despite being freely available, is actually blocked in some countries. So long story short, they took down the YouTube video because it looked like I was parting content. And obviously we don't want to do that. So I'm going to skip over that part for the recorded lecture, but I do encourage you, go to Google, search Weight of the Nation, and go check out the activities there. I will see if I can post the short videos online. But Weight of the Nation really relates to what we were talking about last class in the diabetes lecture. And it's looking at what are the trends happening, particularly in the US now. What are the consequences and effects of high levels of obesity? How does that work within the body? What's the forecast for the future? So some pretty cool stuff there that I think you'll really get a lot of use out of. And I think as you move forward in your own life and learning more about kinesiology and perhaps working with clients, I know a lot of you are doing that now as part of another class. I think this kind of information is really cool and it offers some really neat tools. So go check it out. I also want to bring your attention to this, which is from the National Institutes of Health. Specifically, this is the Subcommittee on Diabetes and Digestive and Kidney Diseases. But this is another big US government agency. And they offer this thing called the Body Weight Planner, which kind of falls into this as well. So I'm going to encourage you to go ahead and check it out. I don't know if I can, from where I am right now, link to this, but if I can, so you can get it now, it will not open. So that's okay. I've got screenshots of what you can go through and check out. So if we start over here on the left, okay, starting information, if you type in that link below or cut and paste or whatever and put it into your browser, it'll bring you up to the Body Weight Planner. And it's going to ask you things just about yourself or your client that you're working with. So here I've just made a fictitious person. So I said that this was a 225-pound male who's about 40 years old, just shy of 6 feet. And then here you can see the physical activity level at the bottom. And mine has a factor of 1.4 and it says estimate your level. So what you can do is you can actually click on that estimate your level button, and it's going to bring you to another screen that's going to help you figure out, well, how much activity do you actually do, right? So it'll give you words that are a little bit more clear than just a number. One of the really cool things about this program, and some of the stuff on Weight of the Nation as well, is that it's not your typical online calculator for fitness and health. These calculators are based and rooted in some really good and really strong and highly powered scientific studies. So the predictive values are trustworthy, I suppose, and they're pretty cool. So this physical activity level, I put in here that this was a somewhat active person. If we move over to the next part here, which is goal weight, what you're gonna do is put in, so I said in this example, let's say it was me, if I'm 225 pounds, I wanna be down to 180 pounds, and I wanna try to reach that goal in 120 days, so about 4 months. So I just selected that somewhat arbitrarily, to be honest, but you could also like select a date. So let's say you're working on a client or whatever, and they have a wedding coming up, or they're going on vacation. So say, okay, this is the kind of weight I want to lose. And it's going to help you project what would you need to do to actually cause that kind of weight loss. And if you look over here at the physical activity change, so it says my weight change phase. To reach my goal, I will change my physical activity by, and then you hit calculate. In this example, I said 41%. So that may not be realistic in all cases, but I said I was a fairly inactive person. And when I hit the calculate button, it's going to pop up another window that says, what are you going to add? So for example, I say I'm going to walk, and then the next column would be 30 minutes or 1 hour every day for blah. And then it says, okay, compared to what you normally do, that would be a 41% increase in what you're doing. And from that, it can calculate what would the caloric expenditure be. And you can see over here in the results on the right-hand side, it's going to pop things out like there's your basal metabolic rate based on the information you gave it. So that's what you'd need just to maintain in terms of calories. If you wanted to cut that out, well, we're going to talk today about what's the value of diet and exercise, and it's saying, well, here's what you need to do to your diet to change that, and it kind of walks you through the whole thing. So go ahead and play with it. I think you'll get a lot more out of it by actually trying it than me just saying it. It's a pretty cool thing. Down in the bottom here, a little bit more advanced stats, and you can go into this and look at, you can sort of look at it from the layperson's side, or you can go in and there's a button that says advanced or health professional or something like that, and you can get a little bit more information. And I think this is kind of a cool graph that comes out of it. So this is showing in the bottom left, if I wanted to lose all this weight, the blue line represents what would be the mean weight loss over time on the x-axis, and then you can see weight on the side. So it would decrease if I was sticking to all these goals. And the light blue that sort of spreads out from that line as you go is showing what is the individual response or the variation within that response. Because obviously some people are better responders than others. So it kind of walks you through and says, well, if this is the mean change, what are the chances that you're only going to lose this much, or you might even lose this much more by doing the exact same thing based on population data. So some pretty cool stuff. Okay, so let's talk about our question today. How can we improve insulin sensitivity? So we did get into this a little bit last class, but we're going to dive a little deeper, and we're going to look specifically at what are the effects of diet and exercise. We'll talk about some more invasive measures, things that we could do like surgery, a little bit on pharmaceuticals, and how do these things combine, and what are the effects when we sort of tease each one out. And it's also important when we talk about this to think about there are two different avenues that we could be considering. One being prevention. How do we stop obesity and diabetes and all these things from happening in the first place? And the second being, what do we do when somebody already has that? And what's the efficacy of different things to change that, or at least slow the course of progression? So let's start then with the, I'll say, quote unquote, well-known recommendations. I've sort of put a question mark there because I'm not sure that they are as well-known as they probably should be, but I think in this group, it probably is. So what are the current recommendations? Well, for somebody with obesity, we would recommend that they undertake moderate weight loss, which would be anywhere between 5 to 10% of body weight. We're going to come back to that to talk about what is moderate and what's realistic and how does that fit in. And that should be combined with physical activity. So 150 minutes per week falls right into the Canadian guidelines, and they should do that to reduce the risk of becoming insulin resistant. So basically what they're saying is physical activity and weight loss are recommended as a combined intervention. So that's diet and exercise. But there is some debate regarding the respective effects of diet or exercise on insulin resistance. So which one's actually driving the bus? Is it the fact that you're moving more, or is it the fact that you're eating less, or at least eating better? I'm also going to point out, as a bit of a segue into our next slides, that the impact of diet manipulations or exercise in the absence of weight loss is less clear. So is it the fact that you're actually doing these things or doing them better than you were before? Or is it simply that these things cause weight loss, and the weight loss itself is what's affecting everything else? So we do know from our past work and looking at some of the rats in our last lecture that weight loss is probably linked. So let's take a look at what we see. There is a pretty clear consensus that weight loss does decrease insulin resistance, and this shouldn't be a surprise to you. I mean, look at these people in the top corner. Look at how happy they are about their scale reading 0. Somebody should really teach them how to use it. But let's look at the graph here, some real data. So here we're looking at blood glucose levels. Okay, so following an OGTT, I'll remind you that is an oral glucose tolerance test. And the oral glucose tolerance test is the one where we give somebody a bunch of sugar. If you drink that sugary McDonald's tasting drink. And then we track how good is your body at putting that sugar away in a proper way. So in this case, they're showing a baseline level of an OGTT. This one's over 2 hours. In the filled in black dots, that's your baseline. And then after an intervention, in this case, that was about 13% weight loss from diet and exercise over 5 months. And you can see that the open circles are much lower. Thus, the body is better at putting away sugar, removing it from the blood after diet and exercise for 5 months. And this is really the same kind of thing. Different study. This was done by 2 high-profile Canadian researchers, actually, out in Ottawa. And they did about 10% body weight loss, so pretty similar, except they did diet and exercise over 7 months. And here we're representing the same thing, except they're doing area under the curve. So they've actually calculated what's the size underneath there. And you can see, again, from baseline, after doing diet and exercise, the area under the curve goes down. Thus, there's less glucose left in the blood, and the body's better at dealing with it. So I think that's pretty clear, but what's a little bit less clear is, again, what was responsible for that? Was it the fact that they're dieting, or was it the fact that they're exercising? What's driving the bus? The second part is, could these effects have been achieved if they didn't lose weight? So by design in these studies, there was significant weight loss between 10 and 13%, depending on which study you're looking at. But what if they didn't lose the weight but still did those activities and changed their lifestyle? Well, before we look at that, I think it's important to understand that when we do see greater amounts of weight loss, we see greater improvements. So looking at this from, this is a study from Ross in 2009, I think this part's pretty intuitive when we're looking on the right-hand side moving to the left, because what we're showing here is, this is decreases, the bars represent decreases in insulin levels. So how sensitive are we getting is basically what we're showing. And across the x-axis is showing categories of weight loss. So in the far right, this is showing somebody that loses 8 to 10% of their body weight, and then they see the greatest improvements in insulin sensitivity. And as we go to the left, we see if you only lost 5 to 8%, still a big change, but insulin sensitivity is not affected quite as much as with a greater weight loss, and down until we get down to 0.1 to -3%. Body weight loss is the least change. And when we look at the control, there's not much of a change in insulin sensitivity at all, because if you didn't change your body weight, you didn't change your insulin sensitivity. So I think that all makes sense. Except when we look at this data point here, like what the heck is going on here? So somebody that gained body weight, so from 0 to +4%, they became more insulin sensitive than somebody who only lost a little or did nothing in the control. How the heck does that work? Well, there's probably a few ways that we could explain this. So I'll point out this is not actually wonky data just from this study. This is a pretty consistent finding. But there are ways we could potentially explain this. So when we think about body weight, for example, what is body weight measuring? Well, it's just a measure of mass, right? So it's actually a fairly broad measure. When we look at body weight, it's not telling us about body composition. So there's one really easy explanation, or alternative hypothesis, if you will, that maybe these people that are gaining weight, particularly in a study like this, where they're probably changing what they eat and how they exercise, maybe they're putting on muscle mass. So again, a pretty robust finding that we actually see, but an interesting one to be aware of nonetheless. Okay, so let's look at the differences between diet and exercise for, firstly, changing body weight, and then secondly, the effect that has insulin sensitivity. So let's start at the top in graph A there, where we're looking at changes in body weight on the y-axis, and on the x-axis, we're looking at time. Pretty broad, it's going 6 months and then out to 1 year. If we start at the very top there and we look at the control, so people who don't diet or exercise, what do we see? Well, there's really no change in body weight over time. Pretty obvious, pretty expected. Perhaps way more surprising, though, is if you look at the orange line there, which represents exercise by itself, we see that over time, people who do nothing but exercise are very unlikely to change their body weight. And part of that certainly relates to what I just told you, is that, well, body weight is a pretty crude measure. It's not body composition, and it's possible that their body composition is going to change, but their weight is not. So you may be dropping fat and gaining muscle, and thus your scale weight is going to stay the same. Okay? But I think the other important thing we need to recognize is that there's a bit of a myth out there that exercise is the best way to lose weight. And in some ways, I'm kind of okay with it because in its simplest form, it's an okay message that people understand that exercise is good for you. And if you're trying to lose weight, you should probably be exercising on top of your diet. But the truth is, exercise is not very good at weight loss. And that's been shown for many years in the literature, but it's a poorly relayed message that really, if you want to be dropping weight, you need to be focusing on diet. And if we look down at the next one, if we look at the red data there, you can see that diet by itself is the most effective at changing body weight. And it's pretty much the same as diet and exercise. So my point there, diet is what we need to be thinking about if we're talking about dropping weight. But exercise probably does have other important benefits. And we'll talk about some of those. But I think some of those are obvious and maybe not related specifically to our conversation on insulin resistance. But we know that exercise is good for the cardiovascular system, it's good for stress, it's good for sleep, it's good for mental health. The list goes on and on. So there are all sorts of reasons that people should be doing exercise. But if it's weight loss, that's probably not the reason. So then let's look at what happens with insulin sensitivity. Now we're going to start at the bottom. And if we look at the control data again, so those who didn't diet or exercise, didn't lose weight, well, perhaps not surprisingly, they didn't increase their insulin sensitivity. Perhaps, again, more surprising, though, those people who did exercise and only exercised, we don't really see much difference from the control again. If we look at the diet group and the diet and exercise group, we can see that up to the first 6 months, there's really no difference, but both increase insulin sensitivity. So eating better and moving more is good for you, but it's equally effective for 6 months. But then we start to see beyond 6 months, diet's going to plateau. It's going to level off. So insulin sensitivity is not going to keep going up. But if you keep doing proper diet and you add exercise or keep your really big spread, and that's where it becomes much more effective. I guess the last point I want to make about this in regards to diet and exercise and what are the roles, it doesn't come out in this in insulin resistance per se, but we do know one of the really important things about exercise is that it also helps maintain lean mass. So particularly when you're cutting things from your diet and you're in a caloric deficit, we want to make sure that we're not totally stopping protein synthesis. We've talked about this already in the protein lecture, but that's a real important role of exercise to make sure that the lean mass is being kept on, because for most people, it's not weight that we want to lose, it's fat that wants to be lost. So we want to make sure that we're helping body composition in that way. So to sum this up, we can say that only conditions which showed weight loss, okay, so there's your diet and exercise conditions, also showed improved insulin sensitivity. And it was highlighted the most by 12 months in the diet and exercise, whereas the diet group just kind of plateaued. So exercise without weight loss did not improve insulin sensitivity. Okay, so then what if we look at exercise by itself, but we don't induce any weight loss? So firstly, how the heck do we do that? Well, it's kind of a neat study design, and the idea is basically this. These people are going to work out, and as they're working out and getting a lot of activity, or maybe not as they're doing it, but at least immediately post-exercise, they're going to be refed exactly how many calories they lost, or they burned. This is going to prevent them from losing weight because we're basically keeping them at a steady weight by refeeding anything burned off through exercise. And what do we see then if people are exercising but not losing weight? Well, you can see over in the bar here, let's call this insulin sensitivity on the dependent axis. And then we have different groups, so lean group, obese group, and diabetic group. So not surprisingly, when we look at the pre-training values, we can see that the lean group has the greatest insulin sensitivity to begin with. The obese group has less insulin sensitivity, and the diabetic group is the most insulin resistant. But post-training, what do we see? Well, if those people exercised but didn't lose weight, there's really no effect. So here they measured insulin sensitivity. It was done 4 to 5 days after the last bout, and that's an important point. And I bring that up because, as we're going to talk about later, there are differences between what happens with insulin sensitivity immediately after exercise or in the first few days, and then what happens sort of to baseline. And this is looking at baseline. It says, well, basically, there's no improvement in insulin sensitivity, regardless of if you're lean, obese, or diabetic, if you don't cause weight loss with the exercise. And so let's look at that a slightly different way. This is done from a different study. Well, what do we see then in these groups if we consider insulin sensitivity through oral glucose tolerance testing? So if we start with the control group, so again, a group that does nothing, what's the change in insulin sensitivity? Well, that yellow arrow represents, it might go left or right, but it doesn't go up or down. It doesn't get better or worse. And that's not surprising. We don't change anything. We wouldn't expect insulin sensitivity to get better. As I just showed you, if people exercise but their weight is kept stable by refeeding those calories, well, again, we don't see an improvement in insulin sensitivity. But when we look at diet-induced or exercise-induced weight loss, we do see that insulin sensitivity goes up in both of those categories. So it seems to be weight loss that's the more important factor. And here, if we look at, this is actually taken out of the study, if we look at the fat loss, okay, and so this is showing on your dependent axis down here, changes in visceral and whole body sub-Q fat, okay, and then the groups are C is control, DWL is diet weight loss, EWL exercise weight loss, and then this is exercise weight stable. Well, what do we see? Sure enough, the diet weight loss and the exercise weight loss, the two groups that show increases in insulin sensitivity, by far reduce their fat the most. So based on what I've just told you then, does this mean there's no need to sweat it? Are we wasting our time with exercise and physical activity? Well, perhaps a bit of a rhetorical. I think I've already suggested that no, we're not wasting our time, but this is an interesting point and one that we want to make sure we get clear. These facts do indeed raise the question of whether physical activity has effects additive to weight loss alone in the treatment of insulin resistance. Okay, so there may be other reasons, but if we're thinking just insulin resistance, I don't know that showed it yet. So does it mean dieting is enough to improve insulin sensitivity? Perhaps, perhaps not. Let's dig into it a little bit more. And if so, why are the current recommendations to combine diet and exercise? So let's see what's out there. I want to come back to this idea of exercise without weight loss. Okay, so I'm going to show you a different study this time, where what they did is they took obese men, so these were already at-risk people, and they trained them for 8 weeks, and again, they refed them the caloric deficit to make sure that they didn't lose weight. And then again, they did an OGTT, and they did that, I point out, 48 hours post-exercise, because they don't want to get the immediate effects of that exercise. They want to look at sort of the longer-term ones that are going to persist. And so what do we see here? If we start in graph A on the left-hand side, this is looking at glucose. Okay, so there's your OGTT. They've got pre in the squares, post in the circles. And this one's a little bit different in that the time scale goes up to 180 minutes. So that means it's a 3-hour OGTT, which is a little bit more rare, but the same idea. And you can see by 3 hours, both groups get back down to their normal point. But if we look at sort of the shape of that, well, we can see that pretty consistently before training, there's a higher level at each of those points than there is after training, even though these people trained and didn't lose weight. So if we look over in graph C on the right-hand side here, that's the calculated area under the curve, and sure enough, the area under the curve before training is much higher than the area post-training. So didn't I just tell you that if you don't lose weight, we don't see that? Well, this study is suggesting something different. This is suggesting that aerobic training, in the absence of weight loss, does improve insulin sensitivity. So what's the difference? Why did it not work the first time I showed you, and why does it work in this one? Well, what's novel about this study is they also, so they trained them hard, they trained them for a long time. They also happened to look at the intracellular lipids. So we talked about this last class about marbled meat, right? What happens when we get fat within the tissue? They also specifically looked at the lipid intermediates that we talked about. So your DAG and your ceramides. Remember, these things I sort of explained work like free radicals, and they wreak havoc, and there's all sorts of signals being sent out. And as it turns out that these things went down as well. So perhaps, does it have something to do with improvements in lipid metabolism? And I'm going to suggest that it probably does. So if we look over here in graph A, well, this is showing you CPT1 activity, and CPT1, if you're not familiar, is it's an essential step in the beta oxidation of fat. Okay, so it's metabolizing fat. And what do we see? Well, the metabolism of fat is quite low pre, and it goes up significantly post. Similarly, if we look at mitochondrial fatty acid oxidation, it goes up as well, pre to post. And we also saw that the DAGs and ceramides, the things that we were talking about in the muscle that are, they do wreak havoc on function, well, they went down significantly. So maybe, does it have something to do with the muscle being able to function properly? And getting there is partially through lipid metabolism. Because we did talk about, well, what happens if we inject lipids into the body? Oh, what do you know? It wreaks havoc. And the body doesn't deal with glucose the way it should. So is timing an issue? Well, I've already suggested that, yeah, it probably is. So why was it so important? Why did I take the time to point out that OGTTs were done a few days after if we want to get at sort of baseline and persistent changes? Well, it's because of this. So this is showing what happens after a single bout of exercise to insulin sensitivity. So here we're looking at IPE is immediately pre-exercise, and then day 1, 3, 5, 7 days after that exercise has been done. And this is looking at the insulin area under the curve. And so if the area under the curve is, it's about a little above 3,500 there at baseline, you can see that the first day after, we're more insulin sensitive. Day 3, even more insulin sensitive. But by day 5, then insulin sensitivity has gone away. So that's saying, yes, you stay sensitive after, but it goes back up. So there's an improvement that lasts for about 3 days, but not 5 days. So how do we interpret that, and what's the importance of that finding? Well, I would suggest that one of the things we need to be aware of is, if this is true, and it is true, then when we're training people, if helping them become more insulin sensitive or less insulin resistant, that means we need to think about what does the timing of the exercise need to be. If we want to keep their body functioning properly, then there better not be 5 days between workouts, because they're going to go back to normal. So this is something we want to keep bringing back to the forefront. So you exercise, we get more insulin sensitive, it starts to go back to normal, we better exercise again so that that stays up there. And I want to sort of change gears here a little bit and come back to this idea of, well, if exercise wasn't doing all that much in some of these cases, why else might it be important? And I think this is just kind of a neat example here, not to insulin sensitivity specifically, but I'm going to show you that exercise may help keep the weight off. And where do we have evidence of that? If we go to the National Weight Control Registry, this is something that was done again in the US. And basically what they did is they went to find people and said, okay, we're looking for people that have lost weight, a significant amount of weight, and they're actually able to keep that weight off. And what was it about people who are successful versus people who are typically unsuccessful that sort of pointed us in the right direction of, well, you're actually going to be able to do this. So here they registered more than 2,000 people who were previously obese. And they said, okay, to be in the study, you must have lost at least 30 pounds, which is quite substantial. And you had to keep that weight off for at least a year. And what came out of this was that greater than 90% of those successful losers, that is the people who lost a lot of weight and kept it off, reported using exercise as part of their weight loss regimen. So although exercise may not be that effective in causing the weight loss, maybe it is effective in keeping off the weight. I mean, we know that there are lots of effects of exercise. Even if we think back to last lecture when we talked about insulin resistance and we talked about things like leptin and adiponectin and the signaling of satiety. So we know that when you exercise, you're actually a lot better at matching your caloric need to the caloric expenditure that you had. And so if we're stopping resistance to those signals that are telling us, you're full, you can stop eating. If we don't get leptin resistance, then we're probably more likely to continue eating in a healthy way. Okay, so now is probably a good time if you want to hit pause and go take a break if you're on your own, or you guys can decide amongst yourselves in class. Or Brett can take an example you can take a poll and see if you want to take a break now, go for a bio break and you can come back, start this up in 10 minutes. This would maybe be a good spot. Or if you want to just plow through, I'll leave that up to you. But we're going to switch gears and talk about dietary changes. So we talked about what happens if we do exercise and then we refeed people, so we kind of control for that. Well, let's look at some other things that can happen in just everyday life, what if we're just changing diet? Now, obviously, this is an exercise-based course, so we're not going to dig quite as far into this, but I think there's some interesting stuff that's come out recently as well. So this was a study that came out in Canadian interpretation. Even without weight loss, Mediterranean diets stave off diabetes. So let's take a look at this study. So this was looking at the incidence of type 2 diabetes. And so what they did here is they tracked people over time to say, if you didn't have diabetes and you kept to a certain type of diet, what are your chances of developing diabetes over time? So this was published a few years ago now. It was done in the New England Journal of Medicine. If you're not familiar, it's a pretty reputable source. And let's just talk a little bit about the study design and what we saw in here. So we can look at the participants here underneath the graph. So I guess what I want to point out, this is showing over time, which lines up with the scale underneath the graph. And you see that these are pretty big ends. Okay, so they had about 1,200 people in each of these groups. They lost a few to follow up as they went, which is to be expected. But they had them put into 3 groups that they followed over 5 years. So that in and of itself is pretty impressive when you think about it. That you got somebody to change their diet for 5 years. And the groups that they put them into were a control. And I point out that this control was actually, if you look on the right-hand side here, they were a low-fat diet. And so that's an important point, because even though they're controlling everything else with, they're pointing back to and saying, well, this is what would have happened if you didn't take on these Mediterranean diets. They're actually probably eating much healthier than the general population. If I could go back and change the study, or have them change the study, I think it would be really interesting to see a real control. So let's have people eat your typical North American diet, which I don't believe represents a fairly healthy diet, which is low fat or whatever it might be. But nonetheless, they had the control that was a low fat. They had the Mediterranean diet that supplemented with nuts, which is a big part of the Mediterranean diet. And they had the Mediterranean diet, which really emphasized extra virgin olive oil. So what we can take out of that is we're looking at survival curves here. So if the incidence of diabetes, if we start at time 0, was pretty much 0 in all groups, and we track them over time, we can see that the control group, which your sort of normal diet, but it was still a fairly healthy diet, they had a much higher risk at year 2, 3, 4, and 5 of developing diabetes than either of the Mediterranean diet groups. And so those are what we call hazard ratios there. And you can see that the Mediterranean nuts group did better than the control, but the Mediterranean diet with added oils, olive oil specifically, actually had the lowest chance. So pretty interesting that we can see type 2 diabetes can certainly be controlled through diet. Okay, so does weight loss have to come from lifestyle changes? We've talked this far about what's the role of diet, what's the role of exercise, how do these things play together, how does that affect weight loss, and what is weight loss role? But what if we take all of that out together? So there are other lifestyle interventions that can induce weight loss. And one of them we're going to talk about today is weight loss surgery. So what if we use surgery as a fairly invasive, but at least effective way at causing weight loss? Are we going to see changes in insulin sensitivity? So ways that we can do that, and what we're going to focus on today is liposuction. We could talk about subcutaneous, or we could talk about visceral liposuction, and actually physically removing fat cells. Or we could talk about other surgeries that, like gastric bypass surgery, that are going to stop you from either ingesting the calories in the first place or absorbing those calories. And we'll talk about how that works. So take a quick second. I'm going to have Brett hit pause here again in the live class, and we're going to vote. What do you think? Does this have any possibility of working? So if we actually take the fat cells and remove them, are we going to see insulin sensitivity change? So that's the first thing. We'll do a raise of hands, yes or no. Do you think it's going to work? And then I want you to discuss a little bit here, and we'll go around the room and say, well, why? Justify your answer. Why might that work, or why might that not work? So discuss now. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how this is actually going to work, and then we can consider, could it be effective? Here's how cosmetic surgical procedures actually work. And I call this cosmetic surgical procedures because that's often what is done for it. If you look at how it's marketed online, if you do a quick search, and actually if you're interested, you want to see some pretty gross videos, you can search liposuction, and you can actually see them doing this. And basically what they're doing is this. So you can see this cannula, which is inserted through the skin, through the dermal layer, and down to where the subcutaneous fat is in this case. So basically what they do is they kind of reef it back and forth, and it's cutting and scraping away the fat cells, and then it's basically just vacuumed out with a high-powered vacuum. And that's what you can actually see in these videos online, where it's like it's slurping through, like, and you see the fat moving down the tube. It's pretty graphic. But the basic idea, if you look at the before and after, is a fairly thick area here full of fat cells, and by the time they're done, it's much thinner. So if you look, this is from an ad that I pulled online. This woman had liposuction done on her abdominal area as well as her thighs, and you can see that yes, indeed, fat has been removed. Okay, so if we're actually removing fat, and based on what I've shown you before, that weight loss is and waist circumference are related to improved insulin sensitivity. Well, if we change those two things, then will that change insulin sensitivity? That's a reasonable supposition, I think. But I guess the flip side of that, and this may have come up in your discussion, is, but this is all peripheral adipose tissue, right? So when we're doing this type of liposuction, we're taking away where the body should be storing excess fat. We've talked earlier about how when our body starts to store it in the wrong places, which is, visceral is not as good. When we're storing it particularly in organs or within muscle, that's really causing a big problem. So don't we kind of want to put this in those safe depots? And so maybe that's a con, I guess, is working. So let's take a look and see what happens. Here's what we're looking at now is we're looking at OGTTs, okay? And this was taken from a group of 7 women who had a large volume of fat removed. So they had 10 kilograms of fat removed through liposuction. Let's just put that in context. 10 kilograms is about 22 pounds of fat each. And then they did OGTTs to see what happened. So they did it before they had surgery, and then at 10 weeks, 27 weeks, and 100 weeks post-surgery. And it's important to note that this weight loss was maintained. So they didn't just suck out the fat and then start putting it back on. They made sure that this was kept off so that this was well controlled and attributed to it. And I don't have noted what squares and circles and triangles mean, but it really doesn't matter, because if we look at that graph over a 2-hour OGTT, we can see that the plasma glucose is basically the same. So what we see there is liposuction is not effective at changing oral glucose tolerance when we basically suck the fat out. So are you surprised? Well, I don't actually know how the discussion went in class, but if we look at the discussion from this paper, this is what the authors themselves wrote. The absence of a metabolic therapeutic effect in our subject is strikingly different from the outcome expected from a similar or even smaller decreases in body fat induced by diet and therapy. Sorry. So basically what they're saying there is if this was lost sort of naturally, we would have expected a fairly big change, but there must be some kind of molecular and signaling process undergoing that loss, because when we just go in there and suck that fat out, we don't see the same changes. So can you think of an explanation for why that might have happened? I'm sure there's probably a few we could come up with, but I'm going to suggest one here. Well, maybe it just has to do with where we took the fat from. Because as I talked about, subcutaneous, well, I mean, that's kind of the healthy spot to keep the fat. So maybe it's because it's not visceral. It's the visceral fat that's driving it, because we didn't mess with that in these studies. So if we're talking about retroperitoneal, or we're talking about the stuff right in the viscera as opposed to just underneath the skin. So I don't want to actually spend too much time on this, but in order to talk about, well, what would happen if visceral fat was removed, let's talk about where visceral fat is. So here, I just want you to use this to contrast these different areas of fat. So on the right-hand side, we have subcutaneous. WAT that stands for white adipose tissue. So it could be in the abdomen, just underneath the skin. That would still be subcutaneous, or it could be in the thigh or any other place in the body. And this notes that this would drain into the systemic circulation. Okay, that's where that fat is getting its limited blood supply and dropping into. Whereas if we look over here on the left side, that's showing visceral white adipose tissue, and they're showing, it could be mesenteric, or it could be omental under the omentum. Okay, so that's right up against the stomach there. But the point here is that these drain into the portal vein. And so remember how I talked about how we now know that adipose tissue sends out its own signals. And one of the problems with visceral fat is that it's very close to the other organs, and its signals are picked up readily and drain into circulation, and they spread. So that's one of the things. But let's just focus now on omental fat, because that's what we're actually going to talk about in this slide, about what happens if we remove that from the viscera. So in this case, they went right in through the stomach. So we're not talking about the subcutaneous on the outside of this belly. It kind of looks like a banana. We're looking inside in that blue part there. We have this, that's the abdominal cavity, and we have this intra-abdominal fat. So what happens if we remove that intra-abdominal fat? So in this case, they took all that omental fat out. It was about 1 kilogram from an obese person. And what do we see here? Well, if we look at before removing the fat versus after the fat, 3 months after, we see no change. Wow, wow. So it doesn't appear that removing fat, either from below the skin or within the viscera, is going to be effective at causing that change. So let's talk about another possibility. What about gastric bypass surgery? So we're not going to spend a great deal of time on this, but I think it's important to understand, how is gastric bypass surgery actually done? Because that's going to change the way that it works. So we're going to start with this, which is called the Roux-en-Y gastric bypass. So on the left-hand side here, you can see what would the system look like normally. So you can see food would come in the top, into the stomach, and then into the intestines. And they've drawn these little red lines, these dotted lines, where they're going to make incisions. So this is your typical, now it's pretty old school, still done in a few places, but this is stomach stapling. So what they do is they cut off this area, okay, and then they're going to staple it closed, and they're going to staple into it a little gastric pouch, and then they close off the rest of the stomach. And then they take the jejunum, they cut that off as well, and then they bring it up and attach it to that little pouch that they made. So this is going to have two effects. The first effect is that it's going to cause weight loss through restriction, meaning that if you're eating food coming in here with these orange arrows at the top, you can only eat a tiny little bit of food because your stomach is physically restricted. You cannot fit a lot of contents into that because it's this tiny little pouch now. So then you can see the food is going to come down through the jejunum and it's going to continue through the rest. I'm told that it's actually quite painful if you eat more than a few ounces of food. So this is a drastic lifestyle change. It's not something to be taken lightly, and this is something that, you know, if you were considering this, you would have some very long and involved conversations with your medical professional about, is this right for you, and what are the effects of, you know, if you do eat too much, you can rip the staples, you can stretch your stomach back out, all sorts of nasty things can happen. But it is effective in that way. The other way it's effective is through malabsorption. And I'll show you why that works. Is, again, if we see food is going to follow the path of the orange arrows through here, well, the green arrows, the stomach is still there, and the duodenum is still going to drain into the later part, but that's only going to be the gastric juices. And those gastric juices normally mix with food in the stomach, and so they start to break it down so that that food, the energy and the nutrients, can be absorbed as it goes through the rest of the GI tract. But if we're not breaking it down chemically, and there's a little bit of food that is eaten just comes in, it doesn't get broken down, it doesn't get absorbed. So a lot of that food is just going to pass right through the body. So even of the little amount that you're now eating, a lot of it's going to be worthless. It's just going to end up as poo with a relatively high amount of energy and nutritive value still left in it. Okay, so Roux-en-Y is restrictive and malabsorptive. Let's contrast that with another type of gastric bypass, which is now called the lap band. And they call this gastric banding because basically that's what they do. They make a little pouch, so it's purely a restrictive way of doing this. And again, it just stops you from being able to eat a whole lot of food, because instead of having your whole stomach to be able to fill, you can only fill that little bit above the lap band until it starts to break down enough, and then it kind of slides through, and then it goes through the stomach and into the intestine as normal. Today, most of the gastric banding that's done is done with an adjustable lap band. Okay, so you can see here there's a port that's placed under the skin, and there's a tube that runs over to the band. And basically the band is filled with a saline saltwater solution. And the port that goes under the skin gives you the ability to put a needle with saline in it, and you can inject or withdraw solution to inflate or deflate the band, thus making it somewhat adjustable. I think that's an important change in the way they used to do it, because when they started doing the bands, they would just basically strap it closed, put a belt on it. But this allows people to sort of ease their way into it. It gives some flexibility in your life. So if you wanted to eat at least a little bit more food, today was, I don't know, Christmas or something, a holiday, then you could actually let some of that saline out and let a little bit more food in. But I want to point out that this is purely restrictive because it's any food that goes through there is still mixing with digestive juices. So your chances of missing important nutrients and eating the way you should, even though it's just a smaller amount, that risk goes down. You're also not stapling the stomach, which you can imagine it makes it less invasive, and that's a good thing as well. So are these things effective? Well, we're actually going to start by looking at this in two ways. One, looking at what happens if we do gastric bypassing alone. And in the study I'm going to show you here, they use the Roux-en-Y type of gastric bypass. And then what happens if we do gastric bypass and remove a bunch of that visceral fat? Does it get even better? And I think basically the study design was done this way because if you're going in there to mess around with the stomach and be pretty invasive anyways, well, you might as well take out some of that fat because you're already in there. So they tested both things at once. Then what do we see? So we see that if we're looking at, this is insulin disposal, okay, or insulin sensitivity, we can think of it that way. So if we look before surgery, the first bar here, versus 6 months and 12 months after, we can see in both the white bars, which represent gastric bypass alone, and the black bars, which are gastric bypass and removal of fat, we can see that both groups get significantly more insulin sensitive after that surgery. But if we look at 6 months and 12 months after, removing the visceral fat did not add to that at all. So it's really driven by the Roux-en-Y. So is this type of invasive surgery, stomach stapling or lap band, is it effective? Yes, it is. Looking at that in one other way here, so is it an insulin sensitizing surgery? Yes, I've already shown you that it is, but here what we're looking at is different groups. So here's a lean group who we would expect is the most insulin sensitive, and they are. We look at a group that has a higher BMI, and they're less insulin sensitive. If they're morbidly obese, you're less insulin sensitive. And what happens after surgery? So we take a group here, and we see that insulin sensitivity is quite high. Perhaps not surprising that insulin sensitivity is much higher than somebody who's morbidly obese. But if we compare them to a weight-matched control, we can see that they are much more insulin sensitive. So there's something about the banding. There's that internal signaling that's saying we need to be more sensitive to the insulin signal. So I think that's kind of a neat addition to that, showing that how we lose the weight and putting the right stresses on the body cause the body to adapt and change insulin sensitivity. So let's sum up sort of what we've talked about so far. Diet, exercise, and surgery. It's quite clear from the evidence that lifestyle changes that cause weight loss improve insulin sensitivity. Okay, and I've shown you that in a few ways. We can do it through diet, primarily, diet and exercise, and we even looked at changing it with other restrictive and invasive methods, and when there's weight loss involved, insulin sensitivity gets better. Interventions that don't result in weight loss can still improve insulin sensitivity. So when we refeed people, we see that we can still have an effect, okay? But there is some inconsistency in this. So I showed you some studies that showed, well, exercise alone does nothing for insulin sensitivity if there's no weight loss. And then I showed you other ones that said, well, yeah, but you know, if we change sort of the underlying factors here, if we get better at lipid metabolism, then exercise still is important. So some of this may have to do with study design, but it does look like exercise may play a role in that. And even if it doesn't, exercise still plays an important role, which is the point to take home. But diet seems to be driving the boat. Exercise is not a requirement to show improvements in insulin sensitivity, as I just said, so diet can certainly be part of that. But interventions which include exercise may have added benefits. Okay, so improved skeletal muscle metabolism, better weight maintenance, etc. And lastly, gastric bypass surgery may be extreme. In fact, I'd say it certainly is extreme, but it's effective if we want to promote weight loss and improve insulin sensitivity. Okay, but certainly there are other challenges that come with that. I'm not saying it's a panacea, but there may be value in doing that. But when we look at liposuction, whether it be subcutaneous or removal of visceral fat, in and of itself, just getting the fat cells out of there does not change insulin sensitivity. Okay, so that takes us to the assigned readings, which you will find already posted online, and we've put up the questions there so you can go through them. And the first one you're going to read is by Toledo et al. And we've actually done a bunch of studies that are kind of similar to this one I'm going to have you read. But what I want you to focus on, this is your turn. I want you to go through, read it, interpret it, and let's start practicing those skills of how do we make sense of the data I'm giving. It's going to be super important when we get to the in-class critical analysis assignment. Okay, let's talk a little bit about drugs. Are anti-diabetic drugs as effective as lifestyle interventions? And how do they work? So we talked a little bit last class about metformin, one of the most popular diabetic drugs prescribed. So I want to think a little bit about, well, should you take drugs in combination with lifestyle changes? That's a joke. We're not talking about those kind of drugs, although if that's what you're thinking of, maybe lifestyle changes are indeed warranted. I think the only way that those types of drugs are affecting glucose levels is if you get the munchies, but I digress. So let's focus on metformin. So what is metformin? As I said, it's a common anti-diabetic drug, okay? And what does it do? Well, essentially it's an insulin sensitizer, okay? So it's going to make the effects of insulin more pronounced. There is a fair bit of evidence that metformin has its most prominent effect on the liver. And what I mean by that is it decreases hepatic glucose production. So if we're breaking down less glycogen and putting it out into circulation, then we're going to have less glucose in the blood that we have to worry about in the first place. There are also some effects on skeletal muscle, but they're not as well known or maybe not as strongly shown. But there is evidence that it could change AMPK, which is going to affect fatty acids. It could certainly increase muscle glucose uptake. Okay, so about 85% of insulin-stimulated glucose uptake happens in the muscles. So there could be that direct effect for sure. And it may also alter lipid metabolism. We know that the effects of insulin, one is to affect what's going on with blood glucose, but the other is, well, what's going on with fats, and are we dealing with those as well? So getting at that, I want to come back to this article, New England Journal of Medicine article. It's a great one looking at diabetes prevention and what happens if we prescribe metformin to people as a preventative measure versus lifestyle. So again, you can find that up online. Go through it. This is a great study. It really promotes exercise, so read this one carefully. Okay, so let's finish off with another provocative question here. Does everyone need to lose weight if they're obese? So if you're carrying extra fat, based on some of these things we've talked about, does that mean you absolutely need to get on a weight loss program and get that sorted out? Well, I'm going to suggest to you that obesity is it's a strange thing, and it's a heterogeneous phenotype, meaning it doesn't always present in exactly the same way. And there's a bit of a paradox that we're going to talk about, in that not all obese individuals are metabolically unhealthy, and not all lean people are metabolically healthy. So when we kind of go to the stereotypes, I think we think of this, and this probably does hold true for the majority of people, but not all. Now, if we think about these people at the end of the spectrum, they're drawn as obese, so they're at risk for type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease, whereas the lean person in the middle is not at risk for either of those things. But I'm going to suggest to you, we do have these cases where that lean person in the middle could be at risk for type 2 diabetes or cardiovascular disease, whereas the obese person may have no risk at all. How does that work? Well, there's some interesting studies going on what we call metabolically healthy obese people. And a lot of this work is actually being done by some pretty clever people at the University of Guelph, which is kind of a cool content point. But we now understand that we can have, on the left-hand side, we can have lean, healthy people. In the middle, we can have what we call metabolically healthy, obese people. And on the right, we can have metabolically unhealthy, obese people. So we want to understand a few things. Why do we need to study this? Because the metabolic and molecular triggers that cause these diseases, such as type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease, they're not fully understood. we don't know why some people develop this and why other people don't. As such, the metabolically healthy obese give us this really cool opportunity to start to look at factors that might be able to protect people from these complications. So if we can figure out what it is about somebody who might be obese but doesn't become metabolically unhealthy and they have this protective effect, well, what if we could turn that into a drug? Or what if there's something about their lifestyle that is different? And if we could take that and we could make that into a treatment, then we could certainly start to help people. So let's look at the metabolically healthy obese. And I think it's interesting when we start to compare the healthy obese to the unhealthy obese, that there are certain things that we can accept that we know are the same, certain things that we know are different, and there are things that we just don't know. We know we don't know yet. So things that are similar between those who are metabolically healthy and unhealthy in obesity, well, they have high BMIs. They have high percent body fats. I mean, by definition, that's what made them obese. So yes, those things will be similar. Things that we know are different, well, for whatever reason, metabolically healthy obese are much more insulin sensitive. Okay? They also have differences in their circulating lipids, and part of that has to do with the fact that they're sensitive to the insulin signal. So they don't have this hyperinsulinemia. Their body responds, it takes glucose out of the blood, and it deals with fats. Another thing that we understand is that inflammatory markers are involved. So things like C-reactive protein, interleukin-6, TNF-alpha. We know that chronically high levels of these lead to morbidity and mortality. And if in the healthy, we don't see these inflammatory markers, and in the unhealthy, we do, we want to understand what is it that's driving that. Why are we seeing this difference in response? And why is the metabolically unhealthy kind of freaking out to this, whereas the healthy is able to deal with it? Some of the things we don't understand is, well, what are the differences in body composition? So yeah, both are obese and have much more fat, but is there differences in the way it's stored, in the way that it works? So when we look at tissue function, are there different signals being sent out from the adipose tissue or the muscle and liver, or are they receiving different signals or interpreting them differently? Are there underlying things in gene function? So if you're familiar, Claude Bouchard's group, for one, they're trying to map the entire human genome and try to understand what is it and what combination of genes being expressed lead to different things in the body. So this is a massive project. It's really kind of cool. I will point out that I think that it's probably oversimplified in the media, as if one gene is responsible for obesity or human performance or whatever it is. And I think one of the first things we've come to realize is that there are multiple genes controlling the exact same thing, and the combination of these genes expressed in different ways can lead to different things, and it's really, really complex puzzle to deal with. But understanding that is certainly an area of future research, and understanding the metabolic response as well. So maybe there are differences in things like thermogenesis. So is a metabolically healthy obese burning off that fat in a different way than metabolically unhealthy, or whatever it might be. Okay, so we're going to take another quick break here. We're going to do a bit of a chalk talk. And here's what I want to discuss is I've shown you evidence, and I think I'm probably preaching to the choir here. We know that lifestyle changes, diet, exercise, other things can be very effective. And as I say here, it's great on paper, but in reality, is it really all that effective? And I think we'd argue it's probably not, because if it were really effective and easy to do, then everybody would just do it and we wouldn't have an issue. So let's brainstorm for a second here. I want you to get together with people beside you, first of all, and we're going to talk about why do people find lifestyle changes so hard. So I want you to make some notes. What are the barriers to success? Okay. What are the big things that people are struggling with? And how can we help people overcome them? So you're going to get together with your group, talk about these things, and then as a bit of a chalk talk, we'll share our ideas. And let's see how big of a list we can get going on the board here. Brett's going to write them down for you. Okay, go. Okay, hopefully a fruitful discussion. I'm just going to add to that a little bit. I want to show you some neat information that shows what are our views of success like, and are we realistic? And when I say we, I mean humans in general. Are we realistic about our chances of success? So what I'm showing you here is a graph that has weight on this side, and then different categories of when they ask people about what do you want your weight to be and how would you classify your weight? So I've drawn a red line here showing what was people's weights at their highest level. Okay, so they asked people, how heavy have you ever been? And then they said, okay, what's your weight now when we start to look at their initial weight? And you can see that most people that are trying to lose a little bit of weight have had a little bit of success. They're not at their highest point anymore. And then they say, well, what would your goal weight be? Okay, and you can see the goal weight is significantly lower than their highest weight or their initial weight. And it's kind of amusing to me is they say, well, what was your lowest weight? And you can see their goal weight is almost the same as the lightest they've ever been. And I think for most people, let's take your typical, I don't know, 40, 50-year-old person. And you say, okay, what's your goal weight? And they say, oh, well, I want to be this many pounds. And then you look at it, you go, oh, and that's about what you were in high school? I think if we just stop and look at that, we say, like, is that really realistic that you're going to get your high school body back? I suggest for many people, maybe not. And when we look at their ideal weight, perhaps this says something even more about our realism in our goals. Ideally, people are suggesting they would rather be lighter than they ever have been before. Now, for somebody that struggled with their weight their whole life, maybe that makes a little bit of sense, but when you consider that this is the average response, you go, how realistic is that goal? You want to be something that you've never been before. That's not saying it's not possible, but for most people, the chances of success are going to be quite low. I'm going to draw another line on here, and this shows where would medically meaningful weight loss be. And so I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture that 5 to 10% would be moderate. And this is what that would look like. So I think that's really telling in that you look at the change between the red and the green, and then look at how much space there still is before we start to hit goal or ideal. And that's a big discrepancy, right? So what you probably should be doing versus what you think you want to do. And even if we doubled that, go down to 20%, we're still a fair ways off. And you can see that that 20% lines up with disappointed. So that was the weight that people said they would be disappointed if that's all they lost. So it's above their goal, but it's twice what they probably need to make a meaningful change in their health. Just going through the last ones, this would be, beside disappointed, would be what would be acceptable, what would they be happy with, and what would their dream weight be? And their dream weight kind of lines up with their ideal. So I think that's really interesting in that as health and exercise professionals, we need to think about, well, how do we help people set realistic goals? Because one of the problems with missing goals is, and I think this is just human nature, you go, well, yeah, I really want to do this, and then you're not getting there, and you get upset and sad about it, and then you just kind of fall off the train. Because if you're not going to make it all the way, then you're not going to do anything at all. But maybe making it all the way was never realistic. So if we set smaller or smart goals, which I'm sure you've talked about, maybe we're only going to try to lose 5%, and we meet that. Okay, then let's reset. Let's come up with a new goal. Maybe we're going to lose 5% again, and we keep that going. And I think success will be much higher. One last thing I want to point out, I just think this is some interesting research in looking at, well, what are the differences in sex expectations? And I'm not going to say that men or women are smarter or more realistic or anything like that that's going to get me into hot water, but I do think it's important to understand that there are differences between the sexes in our goal setting. And I'll point out right off the bat, and from the last slide, you already know this, that both sexes are unrealistic in goal setting. But if we look at, these are called box and whisker plots, with the line in the middle representing the mean, then we've got your variation about that mean, and then we've got the range as well. So if we're looking at realistic goals, well, realistic would be 5 to 10% change in males. But what were males' goals? Well, a lot of males said they wanted to lose. They wanted to be 70% of what they were at baseline. So they wanted to lose 30% of their weight. Well, based on what I just showed you, that's not all that realistic. It's a little bit closer than some of what we saw already. And when we look at females, the average female wanted to be less than 60% of their baseline weight. So they almost wanted to lose half of their body. We can kind of chuckle about that, but I think there's something important to recognize about that. Now, this is more of a sociological or psychological question than it is physiological, but why do we see those discrepancies? Why do we see people that are so unhappy with their body image? There probably is a lot of societal pressures, and those probably do differ between men and women, particularly when we're talking about weight versus body composition and yada yada. But the point being here, helping people set realistic goals and understanding how far off they may be off their goal It is going to depend on the individual for sure, but we do see patterns in the way people set these goals and how good or how bad they are at setting those. And so I want to end with one final slide here, and I'm going to challenge you here for a second. So I've put up a bunch of lines here. This is taken from data from studies. Some studies lasted longer than others. Some make it all the way to the end, and some don't. But these lines represent what's going on with long-term weight loss. So we can see here, one of the first patterns that jumps out to me is that by 6 months, we see kind of this dip in almost all those lines. So in the short term, these lines, which represent different ways to accomplish that weight loss, they all work pretty well at the beginning, but then the efficacy over time starts to change. So some are quite effective at the beginning and then not so effective as you get longer into it. And some don't seem to work all that well even in the beginning and remain that way. So I want to take a second here. We can hit pause if we want. And I want you to try and guess, what are these lines representing? I'll tell you, some of these we've talked about. Some of these we haven't. There's a few things on here we didn't talk about at all. But let's take a second and challenge yourself. Based on the shapes of those curves, what do you think that those are? Okay, go. Okay, and so finishing off here, I'm actually going to pop up what these are. I hope that some of you were able to get this. So what we're showing you here, I'm just going to highlight a few. Let's look at the light blue line at the bottom. I wonder if anybody actually got this one. I feel like you might have if you thought about it. So this is your typical very low energy diet. So choose whatever the diet of the month is. Atkins, low carb, paleo, gluten-free, whatever it might be. Very restrictive diets. Well, yeah, they can be really effective in the short term. But if we look, the efficacy, by the time we get it a few years out, it's very low. And I think that's probably not all that surprising when we think about it, because yeah, we can maintain these things over the short term where we're not eating a lot, or everything that you make has to be specially prepared, and it's really hard to eat that way. So over time, people get fatigued by trying to maintain that diet, and it starts to regress back to normal. Let's look at a few other here. One that really jumps out to me is the black line across the top. Advice alone. Basically, what that tells you is short-term or long-term, just telling somebody what to do is extremely ineffective. It's about a 0% weight loss. And yet, when you think about how a lot of programs go, you go to see your clinician, for example. What does your doctor say? Oh, so you got to lose some weight. Let's get on that. We'll follow up next time I see you. Completely ineffective. So I think, again, from our perspective, that's an important thing to know. Just telling somebody what to do is not all that important. And we, as exercise and health professionals, have the ability to do more than just tell somebody what to do. We have the ability to show them and to coach them through that. So that helps you establish your worth, I think, in this sort of a field. But it's also important to think about, how do we deliver those messages then? Just telling them, oh, well, this is going to happen with insulin sensitivity if you do this. That message will not help much at all. And then to some of the stuff we talked about today, we can see the yellow line represents exercise alone. The blue line represents diet alone, so more effective than exercise, which confirms what we talked about. If we look at, where did we lose? The green line there, diet and exercise. Well, there we go. So over the long term, it is more effective, okay? And when I say long term, I mean, let's also be aware that 6 months is not extremely short either. We're not talking weeks. I guess the last ones there, if you're just kind of looking at them, wondering what they are, sibutramine and orlistat. The first is an anorexic, and orlistat, just by point of interest, orlistat is a type of fat that was developed that the body cannot digest, and thus doesn't take any calories from. So I don't think it's quite as common on the market as it used to be, but I can remember when it first came out, it was a big Super Bowl commercial, and it was Miss Piggy from the Muppets and a bunch of supermodels eating it, because at that time they were putting it into potato chips. And it was supposed to be this panacea to prevent weight gain, and you could eat as many chips as you wanted. So Miss Piggy and Cindy Crawford are smashing chips into their face because you're not going to absorb the calories from it, because it's cooked in this orlistat fat, which your body, basically, it just passes right through your GI system. So you eat it, you get all the sensations of fat, which are great, but it's just going to slide right through you. But I'll tell you, one of the interesting things about that, even though it did work, because your body didn't absorb the fat and it didn't deal with it, it changed your stool, from what I understand, significantly. And I always used to chuckle that on the back of these products containing high amounts of orlistat, it would say, that's a great warning that said, caution, may cause anal leakage, which I don't know about you, but the avoidance of anal leakage it's fairly high priority in my life. And so perhaps that's why we don't see it as often anymore. So back to the main point here. I want you to think about these things, how they work. You should understand this graph for certain, and what's the efficacy of these. And with that, I'm going to give you the thoughts of the day. And thanks for watching the video. I will be back in class next Tuesday, and we'll see you at that point.